There is a particular kind of confusion that most people never stop to name. It is the confusion that arrives in the gap between what we feel and what we think we feel, between the emotion that surfaces first, loudly, demanding to be acted on, and the quieter, more vulnerable thing that sent it up in the first place. Most of us live our entire emotional lives in that gap without ever knowing it exists. For some, that gap is not merely unexamined, it is genuinely opaque, a space where the signal arrives without a label, where the body registers something the mind cannot yet translate into language. The distinction psychologists draw between primary and secondary emotions is one of those ideas that sounds technical until you hold it against your own experience, at which point it becomes almost embarrassingly obvious. A primary emotion is the raw signal, the immediate, involuntary response to something that has happened. Fear when a car cuts you off, grief when something you loved is gone, loneliness when a room empties and you realize you were hoping someone would stay. These emotions are honest. They arise before you have had time to interpret or judge them. They carry information. Secondary emotions are the response to that response. They are what happens when the primary emotion is too exposed, too inconvenient, or too unfamiliar to sit with. And so the mind reaches for something that feels more manageable, more socially acceptable, or simply more familiar. Sadness becomes irritability, fear becomes contempt, loneliness becomes anger at the people who were not there. Shame, perhaps the most generative of all secondary emotions, can become almost anything. Defensiveness, perfectionism, the strange compulsion to point out the flaws in others before they can find yours. The secondary emotion is not dishonest exactly. It is real, it is felt, it drives behavior. But it is not the source. It is the story the mind constructs around a wound it would rather not look at directly. What makes this distinction consequential is not just its psychological elegance. It is what it means for how we act. Most of the things we later regret doing were done from secondary emotion. The argument that escalated past the point of no return was not really about what it was about. The cold withdrawal, the sharp word, the decision made in a state of agitation that hardened quietly into something permanent, these are the fruits of acting on the surface feeling rather than the thing underneath. The secondary emotion demands a response to itself. It pulls toward confrontation, avoidance, control. The primary emotion, if you can reach it, tends to ask for something simpler: acknowledgement, comfort, safety, honesty. But before we can ask which layer we are in, we must first be able to feel that there is a layer at all. This is where the conversation becomes urgent for neurodivergent individuals, those with autism, ADHD, or conditions like alexithymia, which describes a fundamental difficulty in identifying and describing one's own emotional states. For these individuals, the challenge is not simply one of emotional regulation, it is one of emotional recognition. The primary emotion may arrive not as a nameable feeling, but as a physical sensation with no obvious source: a tightening in the chest, a sudden need to leave a room, an irritability that seems to come from nowhere and attach itself to everything. The signal is real, the translation is missing. And without that translation, the secondary emotion fills the gap by default, often presenting as the only emotion available, making the underlying need invisible even to the person experiencing it. This matters enormously because the standard advice, pause, reflect, identify what you are feeling, assumes a kind of interior legibility that is not equally distributed. For many neurodivergent people, the work of emotional literacy must begin earlier and go deeper than it does for others. It requires building, sometimes from scratch, a vocabulary for internal states. It requires learning to treat physical sensations as emotional data, to work backward from behavior to feeling rather than forward from feeling to behavior. And it requires an environment, therapeutic, relational, educational, that does not pathologize the difficulty but treats it as a navigation problem rather than a character defect. This is where the work of emotional literacy becomes less like therapy and more like navigation. The capacity to pause at the moment of feeling, not to suppress the emotion, not to perform equanimity, but to genuinely ask which layer you are in, is a form of precision that changes outcomes. When you notice the anger and ask what it is sitting on top of, the answer almost always softens the next action. Not because you become passive, but because you become accurate. You stop fighting the symptom and start addressing the cause. You stop projecting the secondary onto the nearest available target and start understanding what you actually need. For neurodivergent individuals, this accuracy is not a refinement. It can be a revelation. The moment a person who has spent years believing they are simply prone to rage discovers that the rage is grief-wearing armor, something structural shifts. The emotion does not disappear, but it becomes workable. It becomes something that can be responded to rather than merely survived. None of this comes naturally to anyone, and for some it is harder than for others. The secondary emotion exists precisely because the primary one felt too risky to hold. There is usually a good historical reason why a particular person has learned to convert their hurt into hardness, or their fear into fury. For neurodivergent individuals, there is often the additional weight of years spent in environments that misread their emotional expressions, or the quiet accumulation of being told that what they felt was wrong, excessive, or incomprehensible, which makes the inner life an even more guarded and harder to access place. Recognizing the current emotional state, then, is not merely a technique for better self-management. It is an act of self-reclamation. The promise of this kind of self-knowledge is not perfect emotional control. It is something more modest and more useful, a slightly longer pause between feeling and acting, a slightly better question asked in that pause. That sliver of space between the impulse and the response is where the capacity to choose actually lives. And it turns out to be wider than most people imagine once you learn what to look for in it. For those who have spent a lifetime not knowing what they were feeling, let alone why, finding that space is not a small thing. It is, in many cases, the beginning of understanding themselves for the first time.